Welcome to the Armenian News Network Groong Week in Review for July 7, 2024. Today we're talking with Karen Vrtanesyan. Welcome back, Karen. Good to have you on the show.
Hi, how are you?
Ողջույն, Karen.
Ողջույն.
So last weekend we heard initially from Azeri sources that James O'Brien had extended invitations to Armenia and Azerbaijan to attend the 75th anniversary NATO summit in Washington, D.C. Immediately thereafter, Armenia confirmed and accepted the offer to attend as a partner. There are expectations now that Pashinyan and Aliyev will meet on the sidelines of that summit in mid-July, in about a week or so. And we know that the U.S. has stated 1,000 times that they are ready to help Armenia and Azerbaijan sign an agreement. I guess any agreement which could serve as an excuse for Erdogan to take steps towards Armenia. Meanwhile, as expected, Moscow slammed the invitation and effectively rejected Western meddling in the Armenian-Azerbaijani conflict, saying that Russia's 2020 and 2022 solutions are the best way forward. Karen, the summit is coming up. What outcomes can be expected from Armenia and Azerbaijan attending this?
I don't think that the so-called peace agreement, which is actually not about peace, that peace agreement or whatever you call it will be signed, or if some document will be signed, it is going to be comprehensive, ultimate peace agreement. I don't believe that, because Azerbaijan has demonstrated that it's not going to sign anything serious, and they are preparing for a large-scale war. They do that very actively. They change laws to get more personnel. For example, they have extended the service time for military officers. And there are other movements like this. They opened 3 separate schools for commando schools, etc., etc. On the other hand, their budget for 2024, military budget, defense budget, it was larger by about 20% from 2023, but into several months into 2024, they again added military budget, which was sort of extraordinary to change the budget after the year already started. Mm-hmm. So everything speaks about them preparing for a large-scale war. It can't be a war against, for example, Iran. So the only candidate here for attack, for a large-scale attack, is Armenia. They may sign some papers, some documents, just to win more time or just to get whatever possible, let's say, for free, because Armenia is, not Armenia, but Pashinyan is surrendering territories of strategic importance. And if they can get that for free without any fighting, without human costs, they of course will take it. But at some point, I think there's going to be a large-scale attack, and no document signed anywhere will stop it.
Karen, Moscow's reaction was also to be expected. What consequences could result from attending the NATO summit when our largest partner, theoretically, is very opposed to this?
On one side, it looks like Moscow is outraged. On the other side, this is very convenient for Moscow because they got excuses not to help Armenia as they are supposed to do as allies. So Nikol Pashinyan is providing them with quite believable excuses not to deliver what they were supposed to deliver. And it may be some sort of probably arranged, or even if not arranged, but probably mutually understood without explicit agreement, but they understood their benefits. For Russia, taking on anything except for Ukraine war is quite costly and problematic these days. So for them, it's better if things stay as they are now. So yeah, there will be lots of rhetoric, lots of, anger, etc. But looks like both sides benefit from this. Of course, this is tactical because in a long run, Pashinyan works. There is lots of anti-Russian propaganda going on, almost on official level. There is lots of anti-Russian, anti-Putin, anti-Kremlin speech here in Armenia now, which is, of course, run by Pashinyan. So there is lots of anti-Russian sentiment here these days. But on tactical level, probably it's mutually beneficial.
So you mentioned that in general, the Pashinyan regime's policy is moving towards the West and so forth. But there's some evidence that maybe not everything is as rosy as it seems. For instance, there was this peace forum last week, I believe, where Pashinyan basically poured cold water on the idea of a referendum to join or get people's expression to join the European Union or to join European. I don't know what the exact phrasing was going to be, but Pashinyan said, maybe Europe is not ready for us, and I think that these recent elections in Europe also indicate a shift towards more nationalistic tendencies in Europe, which means less expansionist probably and more isolationist policies. At the same time, I think that naysayers or those who will disagree with you will say that, for instance, look at last week, Armenia's ambassador to Russia visited Belgrade and extended condolences to the destruction and the attacks on the civilians in Belgrade, sort of like in parallel to what they did to Bucha last month. So how do you explain this? I don't know if it's an overture or if it's more warming up to Russia or trying. Maybe it's very superficial at this stage. But how do you explain these new gestures that we're seeing?
Pashinyan has always been a tactician. He solves problems like in the span of 24 hours. So if he has a problem today, for example, he can send someone to Russia, then to Ukraine the next day, then again to Russia. It's as many times as needed. Of course, he also plans in a long run, but if he needs to fix something today, he does that without thinking about consequences.
But obviously, the Russians aren't buying that, right?
Sorry.
But I mean, he's not fooling the Russians by doing this. So who is he fooling by trying to do these gestures?
Well, this can be asked from Russians, or he can. I mean, it's not about fooling. It's just about showing something. Yeah, of course, the Russians aren't going to believe him, but at least there is some face saving probably for Pashinyan and for Russians too. So I wouldn't give much weight to this kind of small tactical things. We know that for Pashinyan, he can contradict himself in a matter of one speech, which is usual for populists like him. So I wouldn't give that much attention to that. As for the so-called European referendum or whatever it is, it's rather a pre-election. It's a preparation for elections. I think it's going to be an electoral program for a number of parties, which are considered by many to be just goals, how you call it, technical parties, who are going to give the look and feeling of being opposition to him, but they are totally controlled by him. These are so-called pro-European forces, but actually this is not about Europe, this is not about West, it's just about the preparation for electoral campaign. That's it. So this is just a PR stunt.
Moscow continues to talk about the November 2020 agreement. Almost none of that statement has been implemented by Azerbaijan. Moscow has also failed to keep up its end of the bargain, regardless of who's to blame for what. So that agreement to me just seems like a sham document at this point. What expectations does Moscow still have from it?
I think they are just using it as long as they can. They also, being busy with Ukraine war, they have no much choice but to pretend that the document still works. But they are going to be probably the first to denounce it when they don't need it anymore. Right at this moment, they have problem of resources. They have bigger problems to solve in Ukraine, which are much more important to them than Armenia and South Caucasus at this point. So probably they are just winning some time until they are able to do something about the situation in Caucasus, where Turkey is getting more and more influence, and because of the 44-day war, and that's it.
One of the spokesmen for the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Andrei Nastasin, accused NATO of arming Armenia and helping it rebuild its defense sector under the guise of boosting Armenia's resilience. Is this an implicit admission by the Russians that they were complicit in keeping Armenia disarmed and defenseless? What do you think?
Well, it's very similar to what Azerbaijan says, and looks like that formerly our ally has a coincidence of interest, at least at this point, of Russia and Azerbaijan. I'm not sure for how long this is going to be, because Azerbaijan, of course, wouldn't be very happy to get under the Russian influence and actually under the Turkish influence too. Ilham Aliyev is trying to retain as much of sovereignty as possible, which will be hard both with Russia and Turkey. But at this point, Russia is not in a position to be more active, to play more active in the Caucasus.
I agree with you. Interestingly, the Russians accused NATO, but the Azerbaijanis are accusing France of arming Armenia.
Yeah.
Okay, let's turn our attention to the so-called border talks. On April 19, the Armenian and Azerbaijani border commissions had declared that by July 1, there would be clear regulations with which the demarcations and delimitation negotiations would proceed. Based on that statement, Pashinyan went ahead and handed 4 villages in Tavush to the Azeris. Well, July 1 has come and gone, and there are no regulations in sight, and we do not know the basis for any so-called agreements for the border commissions. We do not know the maps on which they conduct discussions. Pretty much nothing is known of this process except that Pashinyan is making unilateral concessions and getting nothing back for it. Can you say what is the reason for not meeting this July 1 deadline? Both sides made statements which basically said things are continuing to go on, but that I'm not sure that's an answer.
First of all, when we say Pashinyan didn't get anything, we clearly don't know what Pashinyan got for that. I mean, Armenia didn't get anything, but I'm far from the idea of equaling Pashinyan's interests with Armenian interests. He's been using to keep his personal power. He's been yielding Armenian interests, surrendering Armenian interests for quite a while. So let's differentiate between Armenian interest and Pashinyan's interest. Actually, even back in April, then in May, lots of people, experts, said that nothing is going to be over neither by July 1st or anytime soon, because we have been through this already several times. Remember, first they give some dates, then the dates change, then again they say something, then they deny that, whichever it was said by them. Like, for example, we are going to surrender Berdzor. No, we aren't going to surrender Berdzor. Now, and then they say, like, you have 3 days, they said to people, to dwellers of Berdzor, like, you have 3 days to pack and leave. Then they say, oh no, wait, you aren't going to leave. And this happens so many times that people are being totally immobilized, demoralized. And it looks like this is what they are doing now too. And this is called, it is called strategic uncertainty in, in strategy, in military strategy, and also in psychological and information operations. So this is probably what we see, strategic uncertainty, which totally destroys the will to resist whatever processes are ongoing now.
Yeah, if you ask me, he's causing strategic confusion among Armenians and kind of paralyzing them from taking action against him.
Yeah, it's called strategic uncertainty. It's a military term.
Karen, there is pressure on Aliyev to sign something, anything, as the US hopes it will unblock the Turkish-Armenian Georgian knot. But Aliyev made it clear this week that only some agreement on principles may be signed anytime soon. He has also thrown in demands for changing the Armenian Constitution, recognizing the so-called Khojali genocide, allowing hundreds of thousands of Azeris to settle in Armenia, including Turkish forces potentially, to secure them, on and on. Every day there's something new. And in fact, even today, I think Bayramov was quoted as saying that, essentially changing the constitution is the main precondition, but not the only one. My question is, are these demands from Azerbaijan essentially fake demands that will be replaced by new ones constantly as each one is met? Are these negotiation tactics, or are these, real concerns that Armenia should take into account when negotiating with Azerbaijan? Is essentially Azerbaijan a stable and rational negotiating party?
Since they don't see any real resistance from Armenia, and actually with every new step, Armenia is being weakened more and more, I don't think that Azerbaijan is honest in these negotiations. They are just winning time to be better prepared for bigger, more large-scale military operation against Armenia, because they see a window of opportunity in current Armenian situation. They know quite well, if there is no Pashinyan as the head of Armenian government, they will never get such, concessions. So I think they are preparing for war. So all the demands, they will bring new demands. If you accept their demands, they will bring more new demands, probably absurd demands, probably some humiliating demands, etc., etc. They already do this, but they will continue until they find a suitable moment to hit Armenia again.
So essentially, it is rational if you consider the goals of Azerbaijan, like you're saying.
Yeah, they are quite rational. Yeah.
But then my question is there any value, anything that Armenia will gain from signing a so-called framework agreement that will essentially, it seems, it will not contain any reference to maps. It will not contain anything that Armenians want, such as, guarantees for peace and so forth, just basically principles. What does Armenia get from selling us this idea of making unilateral concessions in order to get this, any agreement signed? We know that Azerbaijan, you explained to us what Azerbaijan wants and what Azerbaijan is, working towards. What is Armenia working towards by continuing to give these concessions and then hoping that they will sign a framework agreement?
When you say Armenia, whom do you mean?
I guess I should have clarified. I mean the de facto leadership of Armenia today.
Okay, so this is not Armenia. They are not there to protect Armenian interests. Otherwise, they would never give away, let's say, 4 villages for nothing. They would never give away Artsakh for nothing, etc., etc. So this is not even a very bad Armenian government. it is not an Armenian government at all, which may sound very radical to some of your listeners, but we should take into account the reality. When you try to analyze whatever has been going on since 2018, like everything makes perfect sense when you stop looking at this like this is Armenian government, this is Armenian interest, etc. When you look at this from the point of view of a dictator who is trying to keep his power and who fights the national elites, let's call them so, whatever he has done so far has served this goal of keeping power at any cost. There is nothing about Armenia here. It's only about Nikol Pashinyan's personal power.
Okay. Now, moving to internal issues in Armenia, let's talk about the Srbazan movement and recent visits by both Pashinyan and Bagrat Srbazan to Syunik. We mentioned Pashinyan's concessions of villages in Tavush to Azerbaijan. That action gave rise to a popular revolt led by Bagrat Srbazan, known as the Srbazan Movement, or Tavush for the sake of the homeland movement. And on June 12, the movement led large rallies in Yerevan, which elicited a violent and brutal police response. This was mostly ignored by Western media, diplomatic corps, and so forth. Over the course of past week, the Srbazan visited many villages in Syunik, warning of the dangerous precedent that Pashinyan has set in Tavush. So after June 12th, Bagrat Srbazan promised to regroup and restructure the movement, which has set regime change as a key goal. What do they need to do to set up for success? It seems like there is some kind of a pause. I don't know if it's a strategic pause. Many pro-Pashinyan people are saying that the movement has subsided. How would you evaluate what's going on right now?
Well, can I go into some theoretical stuff before answering your questions? I promise I'll keep it short. But actually, every movement works on different levels, like logistics, strategic, operational, tactical, etc. And this is true for any movement in any time of history and everywhere in the world. So protest movements are not something that succeed as a result of spontaneous, unprepared protests. People may think that protest movements can win in a matter of days or weeks, but this is not how it works. People outside of the movement usually see only the final part of the whole movement via internet lives or TV broadcasts, but there are lots of things going on behind the scenes for years, sometimes even decades. Think of it as a military campaign. Each campaign is a chain of parallel and or sequential actions which are planned and carried out according to a unified concept, according to strategy towards some measurable goals. And as in the military operations, civil nonviolent movements also need logistics. For example, trained and organized personnel, finances, transportation, etc., etc. And of course, they need strategic and operational planning, information and psychological operations, which in turn requires infrastructure and human resources that should be in place before you start anything. So spontaneous in civil movements is a synonym for failure. And as in military operations, you'll need to take into account that people need rest. There is such a thing as there is a special term for this, which is called protest fatigue, or some people call it activist exhaustion, etc. You need to take into account all of these nuances if you want to have successful campaigns. So right at this moment, it is understandable that most people who actively participated in protests during May and in the first decade of June, they are now totally exhausted, they are tired, and they need rest. exactly the same as it would be for military personnel, for troops. Okay. So, of course, Pashinyan knows that quite well, and actually, opposition should have known that quite well also, because we had 3 or 4 movements so far since 2020, and actually, opposition should have already known all that. And this is the problem with all the movements here in Armenia I've seen so far since 2018, is that there is no long-time planning for any kind of movements I've seen. It's mostly about tactical level, like people decide what are we going to do tomorrow or the day after tomorrow, but it's not going to succeed if it's not planned for months. For months and even for years. Any successful movement starts with a campaign plan. It starts with logistics. You need to train people. You need to mobilize people around an idea. So at first you need some ideas, some shared vision towards which people will be ready to sacrifice their times, to risk their health, etc., etc.
Karen, in the context of what you just said, is the past week of visits by Bagrat Srbazan to various regions of Armenia, does that roll into what you just said, preparing people for an idea for mobilization?
I don't really know that, because it can be just, it can be even some electoral campaign too, sort of electoral campaign, because remember, Srbazan has been chosen to be the movement candidate for the prime ministerial candidate from the movement or opposition. And opposition is more or less united on his candidacy. So that may be part of more like electoral campaign. I'm not assuming there is already clear understanding that we are going to have some elections anytime soon, but that may be some sort of preparation for that. Or we can consider it as this kind of activity. Okay, of course, it can be a mobilizational activity too.
Now, moving on to Pashinyan, 2 weeks ago, he went to Syunik and also other regions. And this past week, he was again in Tavush, essentially appearing to socialize his infrastructure policies for new road networks in the country, but also doubling down on these ideas for policies. Even like some civil contract members went to pose next to the barbed wire fence, saying that they're proud that Armenia went for these concessions in Tavush. What are the aims of all these visits? Is it like what you're saying for Bagrat Srbazan? Is it also the beginnings of election campaigning, in your opinion? And how successful do you think these moves are so far by Pashinyan to reinforce his idea of concessions?
Well, reinforcing the idea of concessions and trying to find some, of course, fake, but sort of justifying of this, I would call not even a concession, but surrendering or capitulation. And this is, yes, part of a campaign. Let's just analyze, or let's just think logically. If he's going for snap elections, he would do exactly just that. He would try to justify his policies, his conduct. He would try to justify surrendering Armenian territory, surrendering Armenian positions to Azerbaijan. And what he does now, he's trying to sell the idea that he's bringing the peace. Of course, less and less people believe him, but some people, they still want to believe him. So that may also work this time too. And yes, it looks like he's preparing for elections. And actually, it looked like that since early winter, earlier this year, when there were lots of talks about snap elections. And this is actually characteristical for autocrats. They always try to get the opposition unprepared, and they sometimes instigate some artificial political crisis and go for snap elections when it is the most convenient time for them. So opposition doesn't have time to prepare.
Interestingly, let me mention that Azerbaijan is holding early parliamentary elections on September 1st. And earlier this year, there were...
Actually, this is also very characteristic for Azerbaijan. They did it several times, and actually Nikol Pashinyan too. We had two snap elections in 2018 and 2021. And also there were snap elections for Yerevan's mayor in 2018. So actually the only election that was done in its due time was the Yerevan mayor election last year. That's it. All the other times he did snap elections. Let's not forget that.
Let's talk a little bit about this business of arming Armenia that Azerbaijan has talked about. Despite state laws on keeping military acquisitions a secret, we read a lot about French-Armenian or Indian-Armenian arms deals. Quite a lot, actually, a surprising amount. For example, we read that Armenia will acquire 36 French Kaiser howitzer systems, that Armenia is considering the Indian-Israeli Barak 8 SAM systems, and other things. We don't hear so much about Russian deals these days, but we do hear Russia complaining about NATO arming Armenia. We mentioned this earlier, and Azerbaijan complaining vehemently that France is arming Armenia. How significant are these acquisitions or considerations for Western weaponry for Armenia, Karen?
Honestly, I don't want to discuss the weapons because remember, there have been such discussions all the time, like, how, for example, Su-30 fighters would help Armenia, etc. But when war started, the 44-day war, they just, didn't work. They just didn't went on combat missions. Later, it was said that there were some problems. They didn't have appropriate missiles, etc., which isn't actually totally true. There are some also nuances here. But anyway, you can give Nikol Pashinyan the best army in the world, and still I'm not sure we are going to win, because any sort of military conflict, it is first of all conflict between state apparatuses, between political, economical systems, and first of all government system. You can have the best weaponry, but you maybe not be able to get shells for them, for example.
And even the logistics of transporting all this weaponry to Armenia is going to be a problem.
Yeah, and also there are going to be problems with logistics, with support, etc. So I'm very skeptical of all these armed deals, because for me they look like more like, again, a PR campaign than a well-thought, systematic attempt to recover Armenian army. Because, you can buy weapons. At this point of time, how are you going to get shells for that, let's say, Indian or French howitzer artillery? How are you going to get them, given the fact that even Ukraine, which has total Western support, don't get its armor on time, its supplies on time. For the last half a year, they had serious problem with supplies, especially the artillery shells and rockets, and that cost them lots of lost territory and Russian advances. So for Armenia, I think the first question to be asked is about the systematic approach to the problem of security. And for example, if you give away your well-prepared, hard-to-reach positions, which happened in Goskepad and Kirans already, in Davush, what's that artillery is for? You can have the best artillery or fortifications, but if your military personnel gets an order to leave it, you leave it. We had very good positions in Karabakh, very well protected, like with underground fortifications. They were huge. Azerbaijanis showed those fortifications in their reportages, in their news reports, showing that they got positions that were, I mean, it was almost impossible to take them. So talking about weapon acquisitions, talking about fortifications, some amateur fortifications built by citizens, you probably remember that combat thing. I mean, that's absurd because let's say you build something there and then you get the order to surrender it. What's next? How this everything is going to help you keep Armenia safe, keep Armenian borders.
Yeah, you echoed my sentiments a little bit earlier that a lot of these acquisitions may be more PR stunts or for public relations with the people of Armenia rather than real military value, at least in the short term. I mean, in the long term, I don't know and I can't guess. But in the short term, when we read, for example, exactly how many howitzers Armenia is receiving and what caliber and what details about it, when earlier this year, I think it was earlier this year, that the parliament passed some law that said these are all state secrets. And yet parliamentarians and the Pashinyan-controlled propaganda machine is actually talking about these details out there in public.
So that's the answer to your question. How come no one is being prosecuted for giving away quoted state secrets, unquoted?
Last week, Hungary's Viktor Orban, who is Aliyev's mole inside the EU, reportedly dropped his veto against providing military aid to Armenia, in quotes, because it's basically $11 million worth over 2.5 years, to set up a field hospital and some facilities for a battalion unit, essentially all non-lethal aid. So the report in the media were that essentially Hungary prevented this deal from happening until somehow the EU agreed to give a similar amount of money to Azerbaijan. Okay, in the context of defense budgets, this amount is absolutely trivial, but Orban was able to extract concessions from the EU to fund demining in Artsakh. And it seems like there's much more politics here than military aid or anything else. What is worrying us, I think, is the fact that does this move by the EU for funding demining help legitimize Azerbaijan's ethnic cleansing, especially as EU seem to be the only avenue where Azerbaijan's moves against Artsakh were being condemned. Even the US is all happy with its relations with Azerbaijan, it seems.
Well, we can consider it as part of that legitimizing process. And unfortunately, given the fact that people who represent Armenia on international stage, they just don't care about Artsakh. Moreover, they support Azerbaijani claims. That means that other countries, of course, they are going to move on because for them, Azerbaijan is much more important than Armenia, which leadership just doesn't care about their own country. So that adds sort of legitimacy to what Azerbaijani did. To the Azerbaijani occupation of Artsakh and total ethnic cleansing of its population.
So essentially, yeah, if no one in Armenia, essentially in Armenian leadership, has a problem with Artsakh being ethnically cleansed, it appears, then why should we expect the EU or the US or anyone else to care about it?
Yeah,
I guess that's where we are. Let's move on to our final segment. Karen, later this month, Armenia is going to host the Eagle Partner 2024 joint military drills with the US. The program trains the peacekeeping forces of the two militaries in their interoperability. And in 2023, about 100 US and 200 Armenian troops participated in this exercise. Meanwhile, the US has called off the Noble Partner 2024 drills in Georgia following Georgia's passing of the so-called quote-unquote foreign agent bill. The Pentagon said that holding the program in the current atmosphere in Georgia would be inappropriate. Both Russia and Iran have criticized the 2023 event. What is wrong with holding these exercises between Armenia and the US?
Technically, there is nothing wrong, theoretically. But do you remember the same exercises in 2023? They were largely propagandized by Pashinyan's media, claiming that, look, the United States are ready to protect Armenia, etc., to provide military support to Armenia. But then they published the photographs from that exercises, and it was obvious that they weren't about any military operation, but they were they were training to contain civil unrest, to break protests, etc., etc. So basically, it wasn't a military exercise, military drill, but rather a drill for police operation. And this is all about it. I'm not sure what they are going to train for this year, but it's last time it wasn't military. As for Iran and Russia, yeah, this was a diplomatic talk. They are against of any kind of American presence in the region. So this is what they were going to say. Actually, the same as with the money for Armenian hospital that Europe provided, the same are these exercises. They are being presented in pro-Pashinyan media as proof that America or Europe are there to protect Armenia, to provide security for Armenia. And many people get a perception of Western support for Armenia and for Pashinyan. So this is, mostly political. From the military point of view, it's almost nothing.
Yeah, I think there is a lot of politics simply because, for example, the Georgian drills were canceled for absolutely political reasons, not military reasons. I mean, Georgia is almost like a NATO-compatible army at this point, and they canceled those drills. I have a question a little on the side. Do the Armenian and Georgian militaries hold joint drills with each other? Why or why not? I don't know if those happen.
There were some small exercises back in 2014, 15, before 2018. There were some military exercises, some drills, some trainings. For example, Armenian Special Forces got training in a mountainous camp. Actually, Azerbaijanis were also training there. So there were some joint trainings and joint drills with Georgians. But I don't think there has been anything like that recently. I haven't heard about anything like that recently.
All right, let's wrap up our topics here. It's time to ask each of you if there's been something on your mind this past week that you would like to talk about. Karen, any thoughts you would like to share?
I would like to share some ideas about future movement, opposition movement, or probably national movement here in Armenia. I see the biggest problem with all the movements is that those who are behind them, they just don't want to learn. All the social movements or all the civil movements here in Armenia and political movements after 2018, all of them were trying to copy whatever was seen on the TV screen in 2018. It's like, okay, if Pashinyan did this and he succeeded, then we should do the same. It doesn't work that way. It works, you need to plan, you need to learn, you need to recalculate lots of things. And this is something that needs specialists. There are specially trained people who specially educated people who has this knowledge, and the success is never guaranteed. There are no universal 100% sound recipes to win. And for me, it's not understandable why opposition forces don't bring in instructors from the Western countries or from other countries where there are people who know how to conduct this. I mean, they have resources for that. It's not that big resources. For every failed movement, there are much more resources spent in vain. This tendency, like not learning, not modernizing, is actually killing me. That's something I can't understand why this. I mean, it's okay to fail one or probably two movements. It's never easy to organize a movement, but at some point you need to start to learn from your mistakes, from others' mistakes. Actually, it is said that like people learn from their own mistakes, and wise people learn from the mistakes of the others. And this is what not happening here in Armenia for the fourth year, and this is totally unexplainable to me.
Hovik, anything on your mind you'd like to share?
Just that last week, on July 5, was Constitution Day in Armenia, celebrating the constitution that was adopted by a referendum on July 5, 1995. And whatever you think about it, I think that it has been a document that should be studied and should be observed for what it is, which is to unifying Armenia. And I just want to wish our listeners a happy Constitution Day. And whether you dislike the Constitution or you like it, I hope you spend time thinking about it and maybe how you can improve it. But it is a holiday in Armenia, and we wanted to wish our listeners a happy Constitution Day.
And maybe people can take the time to read it too. All right, we'll leave it there for today. Thank you, Karen, for joining us. We appreciate your time.
Thank you for interesting conversation.
Yeah.
Yes, Shnorakal.
That was our weekend review show recorded on June 8, 2024. We've been talking with Karen Vrtanesyan, who is an expert on military and warfare strategies with a focus on Armenia and its neighboring region. He is a former coordinator of the website razm.info. Please remember to support us. Go to our donate page, podcasts.groong.org/donate, and become a sustaining member of Groong and give monthly. Thank you in advance. I'm Asbed Bedrossian.
And this is Hovik Manucharyan.
Please follow us on social media and follow us everywhere you get your Armenian news. The links are in the show notes. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you soon.